The slap echoed across the naval command deck like a gunshot. For 3 seconds, the entire bridge fell silent, officers frozen mid-action, enlisted personnel staring in disbelief. Irene Hill's cheek burned crimson, but she didn't flinch. She didn't step back. Instead, she looked Admiral Victor Strand directly in the eyes and said 5 words that would end his 30-year career: "You just made a mistake, sir." What happened next wasn't just about one woman defending herself. It was about a corrupt system finally meeting someone who refused to be silenced. This is the story of how one moment of violence became the catalyst that brought down an empire of abuse. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more inspiring stories of courage and justice. The Mediterranean sun glinted off the steel hull of the HMS Defiant as it cut through azure waters 12 nautical miles off the coast of Gibraltar. The frigate was one of the European Naval Coalition's most advanced vessels, equipped with state-of-the-art radar systems, defensive capabilities, and a crew of 240 personnel. Among them was Lieutenant Junior Grade Irene Hill, 26 years old, communications specialist, and according to every performance review she'd ever received, technically competent but lacking command presence. Irene stood in the communications hub deep within the ship's infrastructure, surrounded by banks of monitors displaying encrypted transmissions, satellite feeds, and radar tracking data. Her workstation was immaculate: color-coded cables, labeled systems, backup protocols clearly documented. She'd designed the organization system herself after noticing that the standard naval procedures created dangerous bottlenecks during high-stress situations. Not that anyone had asked for her input. She adjusted her headset and continued monitoring the secure channels, her fingers dancing across multiple keyboards simultaneously. The ship was 3 days into a routine patrol mission, part of a larger task force conducting counter-piracy operations in the shipping lanes between North Africa and Southern Europe. Routine was the operative word. Nothing ever happened on these patrols except endless hours of monitoring static and updating logs. "Hill, status report on the Eastern Sector communications?" Commander Paul Reeves' voice crackled through her headset. "All channels clear, sir." "Standard merchant traffic, no anomalies detected," Irene replied, her eyes scanning the data streams even as she spoke. "Copy that. Maintain standard watch protocols." Irene acknowledged and returned her attention to the screens. Reeves was one of the better officers. He actually listened when she flagged potential issues, which put him in the minority. Most of the command staff treated her like an advanced piece of equipment, useful for technical tasks, but not worth consulting on strategic matters. The communications hub door opened, and Lieutenant Andreas Volkov entered, dropping into the chair beside her with an exaggerated sigh. Andreas was her closest friend on the ship, one of the few people who seemed to recognize that her quiet demeanor didn't equate to incompetence. "Another thrilling day in paradise," he said, pulling up his own monitoring station. "I heard Strand is coming aboard tomorrow for the task force inspection." Irene's jaw tightened at the mention of Admiral Victor Strand. The man was a legend in European naval circles, 30 years of service, decorated combat veteran, architect of the coalition's current operational doctrine. He was also, according to countless whispered conversations in the enlisted mess, a nightmare to work under. "Should be interesting," Irene said neutrally, keeping her eyes on her screens. Andreas glanced at her, lowering his voice. "You've heard the stories, right? About how he treats junior officers who question him." "I've heard rumors," Irene replied. "But rumors aren't facts. Just be careful tomorrow. Strand has a reputation for asking technical questions during inspections, and if he doesn't like your answers..." Andreas trailed off meaningfully. Irene had indeed heard the stories. Officers who contradicted Strand's assessments found themselves reassigned to undesirable posts. Specialists who pointed out flaws in his strategic decisions were labeled as lacking team cohesion. There was even a persistent rumor about a young lieutenant who'd been dishonorably discharged after filing a formal complaint about Strand's command decisions during a training exercise. But Irene had spent 6 years building her expertise in naval communications and electronic warfare. She'd studied at the Royal Naval Academy, graduated top of her technical class, and spent countless hours beyond her official duties analyzing system vulnerabilities and developing improved protocols. She knew her field better than most officers twice her age. If Strand asked her technical questions tomorrow, she would answer them honestly and accurately. That was her job. The afternoon watch continued without incident. Irene processed routine communications, updated the watch logs, and conducted scheduled system diagnostics. At 1,600 hours, she was relieved by the evening watch and made her way to the junior officers' mess for dinner. The mess was crowded with off-duty personnel, conversations flowing around topics ranging from sports to speculation about shore leave destinations. Irene collected her meal, some variation of chicken and vegetables that all military food eventually became, and found a seat near the viewport where she could watch the sun setting over the Mediterranean. "Mind if I join you?" The voice belonged to Lieutenant Commander Sarah Brennan, one of the ship's tactical officers and one of only 3 women in the command structure. "Of course," Irene replied, gesturing to the empty seat. Sarah sat down, studying Irene with an expression that mixed concern and curiosity. "I heard Strand is coming aboard tomorrow." "So everyone keeps telling me," Irene said, taking a bite of her dinner. "I served under him 3 years ago, on the HMS Resolute," Sarah continued. "He's demanding. Expects absolute deference to his experience and doesn't handle disagreement well." Irene set down her fork. "Are you warning me about something specific?" Sarah hesitated, then leaned closer. "During inspections, Strand likes to test junior officers by asking them to explain their systems and procedures. It's not really about learning, it's about establishing dominance. He'll ask questions designed to make you doubt yourself, to expose gaps in your knowledge. And if I answer confidently? Then make sure you're absolutely right," Sarah said quietly. "Because if you contradict something he believes, even if you're technically correct, he'll view it as insubordination. I've seen careers destroyed over technical disagreements with Victor Strand." Irene absorbed this information, feeling a familiar frustration building in her chest. She'd spent her entire naval career navigating this impossible balance, being competent enough to be useful but not so confident that she threatened senior officers' egos. "What happened on the Resolute?" Irene asked. Sarah's expression darkened. "We identified a critical vulnerability in our communications encryption during a joint exercise with American forces. I brought it to Strand's attention privately, showed him the data, explained how it could be exploited. He dismissed it as paranoia and ordered me not to mention it again." "What did you do?" "I followed orders," Sarah admitted, and the regret in her voice was palpable. 2 months later, during a real operation, that exact vulnerability was exploited by hostile forces. We lost intelligence that compromised an entire mission. Strand blamed it on operator error, wrote up 3 junior technicians for negligence, and never acknowledged that I'd warned him." The story sent a chill through Irene. This was the man who would be inspecting her station tomorrow, questioning her procedures, evaluating her performance. "Why are you telling me this?" Irene asked. Sarah met her eyes with surprising intensity. "Because I see something in you that I lost somewhere along the way, the willingness to be right even when it's uncomfortable. Don't lose that, Irene. But also understand the cost of maintaining it." After dinner, Irene returned to her quarters, a small cabin she shared with another junior officer who was currently on watch. She sat on her bunk and pulled out her personal tablet, reviewing her technical documentation one more time. Every system protocol, every communication procedure, every piece of equipment under her responsibility, she knew it all intimately. Tomorrow, Admiral Strand would inspect her station. He would ask questions designed to test her knowledge and her deference. And Irene would have to decide whether being right was worth the potential consequences. She thought about Sarah's story, about officers who'd been punished for pointing out inconvenient truths. She thought about the countless times she'd already softened her expertise, made herself smaller, more palatable to senior officers who couldn't handle being corrected by a young woman. Irene pulled up her communications system documentation and began reviewing it once more, not because she needed to, but because preparation was the only thing she could control. Whatever happened tomorrow during Strand's inspection, she would face it with the confidence that came from absolute mastery of her field. The sun had fully set by the time she finished her review. Through the small porthole, she could see stars beginning to emerge against the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, beyond the comfortable routine of patrol missions and equipment checks, real threats existed. Her job was to help the ship detect and respond to those threats. And she would do that job correctly, regardless of whose ego it might bruise. Admiral Victor Strand arrived aboard the HMS Defiant at precisely 0800 hours, his dress uniform immaculate, his bearing radiating the confidence of 3 decades of command. He was accompanied by his personal aide, Commander Franz Mueller, in a security detail that seemed excessive for a routine inspection. Irene watched from her station in the communications hub as the ceremony played out on the monitor showing the main deck feed. Captain Lawrence Westbrook, the Defiant's commanding officer, greeted Strand with the formal protocols required for visiting flag officers. The entire exchange was choreographed with military precision, salutes, handshakes, the formal piping aboard. "He looks even more intimidating in person," Andreas muttered from his adjacent station. Irene didn't respond, focused instead on ensuring every aspect of her workspace was perfect. Her monitors displayed current operational data. Her logs were updated to the minute. Her backup systems were verified and ready. There was nothing Strand could find fault with in her technical setup. The inspection began with the bridge crew, then moved through the ship's various departments. Irene tracked Strand's progress through the ship via the internal communication network, hearing snippets of his interactions with other sections. His questions were sharp, probing, designed to test both knowledge and composure. At 1130 hours, Strand's entourage reached the communications hub. The door opened and Captain Westbrook entered first, followed by Admiral Strand, Commander Mueller, and 2 other senior officers Irene didn't recognize. The small space suddenly felt cramped with brass. "Admiral, this is our communications center," Westbrook announced. "Lieutenant Commander Hayes oversees the department, and these are our primary communications specialists." Hayes, who'd been noticeably absent from the hub all morning, suddenly appeared and began introducing the personnel. When he reached Irene, there was a barely perceptible pause. "And this is Lieutenant Junior Grade Irene Hill, one of our technical specialists." Strand's gaze fixed on Irene with an intensity that felt almost physical. He was a tall man, perhaps 60 years old, with steel gray hair and eyes that assessed her like a piece of equipment being evaluated for purchase. "Hill," he said, his accent carrying traces of his German heritage. "What's your primary responsibility in this section?" "Sir, I manage the encrypted communications systems, coordinate with Allied task force vessels, and maintain our electronic warfare monitoring protocols," Irene replied, keeping her voice steady and professional. Strand moved closer to her workstation, studying the multiple displays. "And how long have you been in this position?" 14 months on the Defiant, sir." 6 years in communications specialization total." 6 years, Strand repeated, as if tasting the words. "And in those 6 years, have you identified any significant vulnerabilities in our current communications protocols?" The question was a trap, and Irene recognized it immediately. Answer no, and she appeared incompetent or unobservant. Answer yes, and she risked criticizing systems that Strand himself had likely approved. But honesty was the only option that allowed her to maintain her integrity. "Yes, sir. Several, actually." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Captain Westbrook's expression tightened. Commander Hayes looked like he wanted to disappear. But Irene held Strand's gaze. "Elaborate," Strand commanded. Irene pulled up a technical diagram on her main display. "Our current encryption rotation protocol uses a 16-hour cycle, which is standard across the Coalition fleet. However, analysis of signal patterns suggests this creates a predictable window where frequency monitoring could identify command vessels versus support ships." "That's preposterous," Commander Mueller interjected. The encryption itself is unbreakable. The encryption is excellent, sir, Irene agreed. But signals intelligence isn't about breaking encryption, it's about analyzing metadata, transmission timing, and communication patterns. An adversary with sophisticated monitoring capabilities could identify high-value targets without ever decrypting a single message. Strand's expression was unreadable. And you've documented this supposed vulnerability? Yes, sir. I submitted a detailed analysis to Lieutenant Commander Hayes 6 months ago, with recommendations for implementing variable rotation schedules that would obscure pattern recognition. Hayes shifted uncomfortably. The report was technically interesting, but we determined it fell outside our operational mandate to implement such changes. Translation: Hayes had buried her report because acting on it would require acknowledging a flaw in systems designed by people far more senior than him. Show me this analysis, Strand demanded. Irene pulled up the file, displaying pages of technical data, signal analysis charts, and comparative studies she'd conducted using publicly available research on electronic warfare tactics. She'd spent months on the research, working during off-duty hours because she genuinely believed the vulnerability was significant. Strand studied the data for several long minutes, his expression growing increasingly stony. Finally, he turned to Captain Westbrook. Captain, were you aware that junior personnel were conducting independent research into potential system vulnerabilities? The phrasing made it sound like Irene had been doing something suspicious rather than something commendable. I was not directly informed, Admiral, Westbrook replied carefully. Strand turned back to Irene. Lieutenant Hill, do you believe you're more qualified to assess communications security than the combined expertise of the Coalition's Strategic Planning Division? No, sir, Irene replied. But I believe everyone has a responsibility to identify potential issues, regardless of rank. What you call identifying issues, others might call questioning the competence of your superiors, Strand said coldly. The protocols you're criticizing were developed by experienced officers with decades of operational experience. Sir, I'm not questioning anyone's competence. I'm presenting data that suggests a specific vulnerability. The two aren't mutually exclusive. The words came out more forcefully than Irene had intended, and she saw Andreas wince in her peripheral vision. Strand's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Your tone is inappropriate, Lieutenant, Commander Mueller said sharply. But Irene was tired of softening her expertise, tired of watching good analysis be dismissed because it came from someone deemed too junior or too female or too anything to be taken seriously. With respect, Commander, my tone is professional. If the data I'm presenting is incorrect, I welcome correction. But dismissing analysis based on rank rather than merit doesn't serve the mission. The silence that followed was absolute. Everyone in the communications hub seemed to have stopped breathing. Irene had just directly contradicted a commander in front of an admiral, and there was no walking that back. Strand stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. Listen carefully, Lieutenant Hill. I've been in this Navy since before you were born. I've commanded ships in combat operations you couldn't imagine. And I will not have some junior officer with 6 years of experience and an inflated sense of her own importance questioning systems that have kept this fleet secure for decades. Irene's heart was pounding, but she kept her voice steady. Sir, with respect, the effectiveness of past systems doesn't guarantee their effectiveness against evolving threats. Electronic warfare capabilities have advanced significantly in recent years, and... Enough, Strand cut her off. Your analysis is noted and dismissed. You will delete this file and discontinue any further independent research into operational systems. Is that clear? It wasn't clear. It was the opposite of clear. It was an order to stop doing exactly what good intelligence officers were supposed to do, think critically about vulnerabilities and potential threats. Sir, I believe. I don't care what you believe, Lieutenant. I care about order, discipline, and knowing your place in the chain of command. You will follow my instructions, or you will find yourself assigned to inventory management in some forgotten supply depot. Do you understand me? The threat was explicit. Submit or be punished. Irene looked at the faces around her. Captain Westbrook appeared uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Commander Hayes looked relieved that the Admiral was doing his dirty work for him. Andreas was staring at his console, clearly wanting no part of this confrontation. And suddenly, Irene understood what Sarah had been trying to tell her the night before. This wasn't about technical accuracy or mission effectiveness. This was about power and the preservation of hierarchy. Strand didn't care if she was right. He cared that she had dared to be right in a way that made him uncomfortable. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. The confrontation in the communications hub left Irene shaken but not defeated. She deleted the file as ordered, but the analysis remained burned into her memory. Strand had left the ship that afternoon, his inspection complete, his authority reinforced. Life aboard the Defiant returned to its normal rhythm, except everything felt different now. In the days following the inspection, Irene noticed subtle changes. Her shift assignments became less desirable: overnight watches, holiday rotations, the slots nobody wanted. During briefings, her input was politely ignored. When she submitted routine reports, they were returned with excessive revision requests for minor formatting issues. Lieutenant Commander Hayes called her into his office a week after Strand's visit. "Hill, I need to discuss your performance trajectory." Irene sat across from him, her service record open on his desk. "Sir?" "Your technical work remains adequate," Hayes said, choosing his words carefully. "But there are concerns about your ability to function effectively within established command structures. Several senior officers have noted that you seem to have difficulty accepting guidance from more experienced personnel." The carefully coded language was transparent. She'd embarrassed Strand, and now she would pay for it through bureaucratic punishment disguised as professional development concerns. "I accept guidance when it's based on sound reasoning," Irene replied evenly. "I struggle with directives that contradict observable evidence." Hayes sighed. "That attitude is exactly the problem, Lieutenant. The Navy operates on trust and hierarchy. When you question systems designed by flag officers, you're not just challenging technical decisions, you're undermining the entire command structure. Even when those systems have demonstrable vulnerabilities? Especially then," Hayes said firmly. "Because once you start allowing junior officers to override senior judgment based on their personal analysis, you create chaos. Everyone thinks they're right, Hill. The difference is that most people have the wisdom to recognize when their opinion matters and when it doesn't." Irene felt something cold settle in her chest. This wasn't about her being wrong. This was about her being inconvenient. 2 weeks later, the HMS Defiant participated in a joint training exercise with French and Italian naval forces. The exercise simulated a coordinated response to maritime threats in the central Mediterranean. Irene's role was to maintain communications between Allied vessels and monitor for simulated enemy transmissions. On the second day of the exercise, she detected something unusual, a signal pattern that didn't match any of the authorized simulation frequencies. It was subtle, barely distinguishable from background noise, but her analysis suggested it was a real monitoring system, not part of the exercise. She flagged it immediately to Commander Hayes. "Sir, I'm detecting what appears to be unauthorized surveillance of our exercise communications." Hayes reviewed her data with obvious skepticism. "How certain are you?" 85%. "The signal characteristics don't match any simulation parameters, and the source appears to be a commercial vessel operating at the edge of the exercise zone. Commercial vessels pass through these waters constantly, Hill. It's probably just routine maritime communication." "Sir, the transmission patterns suggest active frequency scanning, not routine communication. Someone is monitoring our Allied coordination protocols." Hayes studied her screen for another moment, then shook his head. "I'm not going to disrupt a multinational exercise based on an 85% probability from a junior lieutenant. Continue standard monitoring and document your observations." Irene wanted to argue, wanted to insist that this deserved investigation, but she could see the futility. Hayes had already decided that anything she flagged was probably paranoid overreach. She documented everything meticulously: signal frequencies, transmission timing, the correlation between Allied communications and the monitoring bursts. 3 hours into her watch, the signals ceased abruptly, and the commercial vessel altered course away from the exercise area. When she submitted her incident report, Hayes filed it without comment. The following morning, Admiral Strand returned to the task force aboard his flagship, and he requested a meeting with the Defiant's senior communications officer. Specifically, he requested Lieutenant Junior Grade Irene Hill. The sun hung high over the Mediterranean as Irene boarded the Admiral's flagship, the HMS Vanguard. The massive destroyer dwarfed the Defiant, bristling with advanced weaponry and surveillance systems. She'd been given no explanation for the summons, just orders to report to Admiral Strand's ready room at 1400 hours. Commander Mueller met her at the gangway, his expression professionally neutral but his eyes conveying clear disdain. "Lieutenant Hill. The Admiral is waiting." They walked through corridors lined with the Vanguard's crew, who barely glanced at the visiting junior officer. Mueller led her to a secured section of the ship, past Marine guards, through a checkpoint that scanned her identification, and finally to a polished wooden door bearing a brass nameplate, Admiral Victor Strand, Task Force Commander. Mueller knocked twice, then opened the door. "Lieutenant Hill, sir." Strand sat behind an imposing desk, his dress uniform immaculate, his expression carved from granite. Behind him, large monitors displayed real-time positions of the entire task force. The room smelled of coffee and old leather. "Dismissed, Commander," Strand said to Mueller, who withdrew and closed the door. Irene stood at attention, acutely aware that she was alone with a flag officer known for destroying careers. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Strand spoke. "Do you know why you're here, Lieutenant?" "No, sir." "Yesterday, you filed a report claiming to have detected unauthorized surveillance during our joint exercise." Strand pulled up a document on his desk monitor. A report that suggested hostile intelligence gathering was occurring under the noses of 3 Allied navies. "Yes, sir. I documented unusual signal patterns that—" "I read your report," Strand interrupted. "Every paranoid, overreaching word of it. Do you have any idea what happens when a junior lieutenant accuses Allied commercial shipping of espionage based on unusual signal patterns?" "Sir, I didn't accuse anyone. I documented anomalous communications that warranted investigation." Strand stood, moving around his desk with deliberate slowness. "You documented your imagination, Lieutenant. Commercial vessels operate in these waters constantly. Attributing routine traffic to hostile surveillance is either incompetence or attention-seeking behavior. I'm trying to determine which." Irene's jaw tightened. "Sir, the signal characteristics were inconsistent with commercial communication. The timing correlated directly with our classified transmission windows. That's not imagination, that's observable data." "Observable to you," Strand said coldly. "And yet somehow missed by every other communications specialist in the task force, including officers with decades more experience than you possess. Perhaps they weren't analyzing the right frequency ranges, sir." The words came out before Irene could stop them, and she saw Strand's expression shift from cold displeasure to genuine anger. "Or perhaps," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "you're a junior officer with an inflated sense of her own capabilities who can't accept that she might be wrong." "I'm not wrong about this, sir." "Yes, you are. And more importantly, you're insubordinate." Strand moved closer, invading her personal space. "I brought you here to give you one final opportunity to understand your position in this Navy. You are not a strategic analyst. You are not an intelligence officer. You are a communications technician whose job is to relay information, not to interpret it. Sir, with respect. There is no respect in what you're doing, Hill. There's arrogance. There's presumption. There's a complete failure to understand that this Navy operates on trust and discipline, not on the paranoid theories of junior officers who think they're smarter than everyone else. Heat flooded Irene's face. Every word was designed to diminish her, to reduce her expertise to delusion, her diligence to insubordination. "Admiral, I have documented evidence." "I don't care about your evidence." Strand's voice rose sharply. "I care that you continue to question, to challenge, to undermine the authority of officers who have forgotten more about naval operations than you will ever know. Then perhaps those officers should be willing to consider that they might not know everything." The words exploded out of Irene before she could contain them. The ultimate sin, directly contradicting a flag officer, suggesting that rank didn't equate to omniscience. Strand's face flushed crimson. "You arrogant, disrespectful." And then his hand moved, faster than Irene expected, connecting with her cheek in a sharp, stinging slap that echoed through the ready room like a thunderclap. For 3 seconds, the world seemed to stop. Irene's face burned where he'd struck her. Strand stood with his hands still raised, breathing hard, his expression mixing rage with sudden uncertainty. And Irene, her cheek throbbing, her heart pounding with adrenaline and shock and pure fury, did something that would change everything. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She didn't cower. She pulled out her service phone and pressed record. "Admiral Victor Strand," she said clearly, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, "you just physically assaulted a junior officer for presenting operational concerns. I am documenting this incident and will be filing formal charges through the Inspector General's office." Strand's expression shifted from rage to calculation in an instant. "You will do no such thing. Turn off that device immediately." "That's an order." "Sir, naval regulations explicitly protect personnel reporting misconduct. I am not required to obey orders that facilitate the concealment of assault." Irene's voice remained calm, though her entire body shook with adrenaline. Strand moved toward her, and Irene stepped back, keeping the phone positioned between them. "Lieutenant Hill, you are making a catastrophic mistake. I will destroy your career. I will ensure you never work in any naval capacity again. I will." "You will be held accountable," Irene interrupted. "Sir, I gave you accurate intelligence assessments. I identified real vulnerabilities in our communications protocols. I documented suspicious surveillance during yesterday's exercise. And your response to professional diligence was violence. That says everything about your command and nothing about my competence." The door burst open. Commander Mueller appeared, clearly having heard raised voices. His eyes took in the scene, Irene's reddening cheek, Strand's aggressive posture, the phone in her hand. "Admiral, is everything?" "Commander Mueller, I need you to witness that Admiral Strand struck me approximately 90 seconds ago." Irene turned slightly to address him while keeping Strand in her peripheral vision. "I'm formally requesting immediate documentation of this incident and protection under whistleblower protocols." Mueller's face went pale. This wasn't a private confrontation anymore, it was an official incident with a witness. Strand's voice became dangerously quiet. "Hill, I strongly suggest you reconsider this course of action. I made a mistake in a moment of frustration, but turning this into an official matter will have consequences far beyond what you imagine. The consequences of not reporting it are worse, sir. Because if I stay silent, you'll continue abusing authority. You'll continue punishing officers who dare to be competent in ways that threaten your ego. And eventually, someone will die because accurate intelligence was suppressed to protect your reputation. That's absurd. Is it?" Irene's control finally cracked, emotion flooding her voice. "You ordered me to delete vulnerability assessments that could protect our fleet. You dismissed surveillance evidence that indicated active intelligence gathering. You've created an environment where officers are afraid to report problems because doing so is treated as insubordination. That's not leadership, Admiral. That's cowardice disguised as authority." Strand lunged toward her, and Mueller instinctively moved between them. "Admiral, please. Let's all take a moment." "Get out of my way, Commander," Strand snarled. But Mueller held his ground, and something in his expression suggested he'd reached his own breaking point. Sir, I think Lieutenant Hill should return to the Defiant while we sort this out through proper channels. She's not going anywhere until she deletes that recording. I'm not deleting anything, sir. And Commander Mueller is right, I'm returning to my ship and filing a formal report. Irene moved toward the door, and Mueller stepped aside to let her pass. Strand's voice followed her into the corridor. You've ended your career, Hill. Do you understand that? You're finished. Irene turned back one final time. No, Admiral. I'm pretty sure I just ended yours. Within 24 hours, Irene's formal complaint had triggered an automatic investigation by the Inspector General's office. The recording she'd made, clear audio of Strand admitting the assault and threatening her career, made the incident impossible to dismiss or cover up. Captain Westbrook called her into his office the morning after she filed the report. His expression mixed concern, frustration, and something that might have been respect. Lieutenant Hill, I need you to understand the magnitude of what you've initiated, he began. Admiral Strand is not just any flag officer. He's connected to the highest levels of Coalition Naval Command. This investigation will have repercussions far beyond your personal situation. I understand, sir. But he assaulted me for doing my job competently. If I don't report that, I'm complicit in the culture that enabled it. Westbrook sighed heavily. You're right. Absolutely right. But being right doesn't always protect you from the consequences of being right. 2 investigators from the IG's office arrived that afternoon, Captain Helena Anderson and Commander James Pritchard. They interviewed Irene for 4 hours, documenting every detail of her interactions with Strand, every dismissed intelligence report, every incident of retaliation. Lieutenant Hill, why didn't you report the hostile work environment earlier? Anderson asked, her tone more curious than accusatory. Because hostile work environments are normalized, ma'am. I thought what I was experiencing was just the standard challenges of being a junior officer. It wasn't until Admiral Strand physically struck me that I realized this wasn't about normal military hierarchy, it was about abuse of power. Over the following week, the investigators interviewed dozens of personnel across multiple ships. And they discovered something Irene hadn't known: she wasn't Strand's only victim. 3 other junior officers came forward with similar stories of dismissed intelligence, professional retaliation, and verbal abuse. One lieutenant from another vessel described being threatened with a dishonorable discharge after questioning Strand's tactical decisions during an operational review. The pattern was undeniable. Admiral Victor Strand had spent years cultivating a command environment where fear suppressed competence, where junior officers learned that being right was more dangerous than being silent. Andreas found Irene in the communications hub during a quiet watch. You're becoming legendary, he said quietly. People are calling you the officer who took down an admiral. I didn't take anyone down, Irene replied. I just refused to let assault go unreported. That's more than most people would do. You know what they're saying in the task force? They're saying maybe it's time we started listening when junior officers identify problems, regardless of whose ego it might bruise. The investigation concluded after 3 weeks. Captain Anderson delivered the findings personally, requesting a private meeting with Irene in Captain Westbrook's conference room. Lieutenant Hill, I want you to know that your courage in reporting this incident has exposed systematic failures in our accountability structures, Anderson began. Admiral Strand has been relieved of command pending a formal court-martial. Additionally, we've identified multiple senior officers who failed in their duty to maintain proper command climate. Irene absorbed the information, feeling oddly numb. What happens now? The court-martial of Admiral Victor Strand began 6 weeks after the assault. The proceedings were closed to the public, but word spread through the naval community like wildfire. A flag officer with 30 years of service, facing charges of assault, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming an officer. It was unprecedented. Irene was called to testify on the second day of the trial. She entered the courtroom in her dress uniform, acutely aware of the eyes following her, some supportive, others resentful. The military justice system operated on different principles than civilian courts, but the basics remained the same: evidence, testimony, and judgment. The prosecutor, Captain Nicole Bergman, guided Irene through her testimony with clinical precision. Lieutenant Hill, please describe the events of April 15 aboard the HMS Vanguard. Irene recounted the meeting in detail, Strand's dismissal of her surveillance report, his escalating anger, the physical assault, and her decision to document the incident. Her voice remained steady, professional, even as she described the moment his hand connected with her face. "Why did you begin recording, Lieutenant?" Bergman asked. "Because I realized that without documentation, it would be my word against the flag officers. I've seen how that plays out, ma'am. The junior officer is always deemed unreliable, emotional, or mistaken. I needed evidence that couldn't be dismissed." Strand's defense attorney, a civilian lawyer named Richard Kellerman, cross-examined her aggressively. "Lieutenant Hill, isn't it true that you have a history of insubordination? Of refusing to accept guidance from senior officers?" "No, sir. I have a history of presenting accurate technical analysis that sometimes contradicts established assumptions. That's not insubordination, that's due diligence. You deleted files at Admiral Strand's direct order during his inspection of the Defiant, correct?" "Yes, sir. But you continued to harbor resentment about that order, didn't you? This entire incident is really about you seeking revenge for having your work challenged." Irene met Kellerman's eyes steadily. "Sir, if Admiral Strand had simply disagreed with my analysis, I would have documented my concerns and moved on. But he didn't just disagree, he tried to silence me. He created an environment where reporting problems was treated as disloyalty. And when I persisted in doing my job professionally, he responded with violence. That's not about revenge. That's about accountability." The testimony continued for 3 hours. Kellerman tried repeatedly to portray Irene as an ambitious junior officer with a persecution complex, but the audio recording she'd made undermined every attempt. Strand's voice, clear and undeniable, admitting the assault and threatening her career. Other witnesses followed, Commander Mueller, who reluctantly confirmed walking in moments after the assault. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Brennan, who testified about the culture of fear Strand cultivated. 3 other junior officers who described similar patterns of retaliation and abuse. Captain Westbrook testified about the deleted vulnerability assessment, admitting under oath that Irene's analysis had been technically sound but politically inconvenient. In hindsight, we should have elevated her concerns regardless of the Admiral's response. Our failure to do so was a dereliction of our duty to the mission. The prosecution's final witness was a counterintelligence specialist from Coalition Naval Headquarters. Commander Patricia Santos presented evidence that Irene's surveillance detection during the exercise had been accurate. The commercial vessel she'd flagged was later confirmed to be operating sophisticated electronic monitoring equipment, likely gathering intelligence for a hostile nation. Lieutenant Hill identified a genuine security breach that went unreported because her commanding officers had been conditioned to dismiss her assessments, Santos testified. The vessel in question collected valuable intelligence about our Allied coordination protocols because we failed to investigate when it mattered. The courtroom fell silent as the implications sank in. Strand hadn't just assaulted a junior officer, his pattern of suppressing accurate intelligence had created actual operational security failures. On the 4th day of the trial, Admiral Strand took the stand in his own defense. His attorney tried to portray him as a dedicated officer who'd made one mistake in a moment of extreme stress. "Admiral, in your 30 years of service, have you ever struck another officer?" Kellerman asked. "Never," Strand replied firmly. "That moment was an aberration, a lapse in judgment during a particularly stressful operational period. I deeply regret it." But during cross-examination, Captain Bergman demolished this narrative. "Admiral Strand, when you struck Lieutenant Hill, was it your first interaction with her?" "No. I'd inspected her station 2 weeks prior. And during that inspection, you ordered her to delete a vulnerability assessment she'd prepared, correct?" "I instructed her to focus on her assigned duties, yes." "Even though her assessment was later validated as technically accurate?" Strand's jaw tightened. "That's a matter of interpretation." "Is it?" Bergman pulled up documents on the courtroom display. 3 separate technical reviews have now confirmed that Lieutenant Hill's encryption vulnerability analysis was not only accurate but identified a significant security risk. You ordered her to delete that analysis and discontinue similar research. Why? Because allowing junior officers to conduct independent assessments outside their chain of command creates operational chaos. Or because her competence threatened your authority? Objection, Kellerman interjected. Speculation. But the damage was done. The pattern was clear. Strand had systematically suppressed competent analysis because it came from officers he deemed insufficiently deferential. The court-martial panel deliberated for 7 hours before reaching their verdict. Irene wasn't present for the deliberations, but she sat in the courtroom's waiting area with Andreas and Sarah, the 3 of them maintaining nervous silence. Captain Anderson found them there as evening approached. The panel has reached a decision. They're reconvening in 10 minutes. Irene's stomach churned as they filed back into the courtroom. Admiral Strand sat at the defense table, his posture rigid, his expression carefully neutral. But she could see tension in his shoulders, fear in his eyes. The senior member of the court-martial panel, Rear Admiral Thomas Carlyle, stood to deliver the verdict. The courtroom fell absolutely silent. Admiral Victor Strand, this court-martial finds you guilty of assault of a subordinate officer. We further find you guilty of abuse of authority, conduct unbecoming an officer, and dereliction of duty in maintaining proper command climate. Strand's face went gray, but he remained standing, rigid as stone. Admiral Carlyle continued, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was about to pronounce. The evidence presented demonstrates not an isolated incident, but a pattern of behavior that undermines the core values of our naval service. You created an environment where competent officers feared professional retaliation for performing their duties excellently. You suppressed accurate intelligence assessments that were later validated as critical security concerns. And when confronted with an officer who refused to be silenced, you responded with physical violence. The Admiral paused, letting the words settle over the courtroom like a shroud. This court sentences you to dismissal from service, forfeiture of all retirement benefits, and reduction in rank to commander. Additionally, you are sentenced to 6 months confinement in a military correctional facility. The sentence was devastating: 30 years of service erased, pension eliminated, rank stripped away. Strand swayed slightly, and his attorney gripped his arm to steady him. This court-martial is adjourned, Carlyle announced. As the panel filed out, Irene sat motionless, processing what had just happened. She'd expected some form of punishment for Strand, but this totality of destruction felt almost overwhelming. A man's entire career, his legacy, his future, demolished because he couldn't accept being wrong. Andreas touched her shoulder gently. "Are you okay?" "I don't know," Irene admitted. "I wanted accountability, not annihilation." Sarah leaned closer, her voice quiet but firm. "He annihilated himself, Irene. You just refused to help him hide it. There's a difference." Over the following days, the verdict sent shockwaves through the European naval coalition. Senior officers who'd modeled their command style after Strand suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. Several requested early retirement rather than face potential investigations. Others began genuinely reevaluating how they interacted with junior personnel. Captain Westbrook called a ship-wide meeting aboard the Defiant to address the verdict and its implications. "What happened to Admiral Strand should serve as a clear message to every officer in this fleet," he announced. "Competence should be celebrated, not suppressed. Junior officers who identify problems are assets, not threats. And anyone who believes rank exempts them from accountability is fundamentally unfit for command." The speech was met with subdued applause, but Irene could see skepticism in some faces. Changing culture required more than one verdict, more than one commander's words. It required sustained commitment to valuing truth over hierarchy. Lieutenant Commander Hayes approached her after the meeting, his expression uncomfortable. "Hill, I owe you an apology. I should have elevated your vulnerability assessment instead of burying it. I should have investigated your surveillance detection instead of dismissing it. I let careerist concerns override operational duty, and I'm sorry. The apology was genuine, and Irene appreciated it. Thank you, sir. What matters now is learning from it. 2 days after the verdict, Irene received orders to report to Coalition Naval Headquarters in Brussels. The summons came with no explanation, just instructions to appear before the Deputy Commander of Naval Operations. Andreas helped her prepare for the meeting, making sure her dress uniform was immaculate. Whatever this is about, you've got an entire task force worth of people supporting you, he said. The flight to Brussels gave Irene time to process everything that had happened. 2 months ago, she'd been an overlooked communications specialist, competent but invisible. Now she was the officer who'd brought down a flag officer, who'd exposed systemic failures in accountability, who'd proven that courage sometimes meant risking everything for what was right. But she had no idea what came next. Coalition Naval Headquarters occupied an imposing modern building in Brussels, all glass and steel and European flags. Irene was escorted through security checkpoints and past offices where officers coordinated operations across multiple nations. The scale of the organization was humbling. Vice Admiral Catherine Rousseau's office overlooked the headquarters courtyard. She was a French officer with a reputation for strategic brilliance and zero tolerance for incompetence. When Irene was shown in, Rousseau stood from behind her desk and extended her hand. "Lieutenant Hill. Thank you for coming." "Of course, ma'am." Irene shook her hand, trying to read the Admiral's expression. Rousseau gestured to a chair. "I imagine you're wondering why you're here." "Yes, ma'am. The Strand Court-Martial has forced this coalition to confront some uncomfortable truths about how we've been operating," Rousseau began. "Your case exposed systemic issues that extend far beyond one abusive officer. We've discovered that dozens of junior officers across multiple navies have similar stories: competent analysis dismissed, professional retaliation for excellence, environments where fear suppressed innovation." Irene listened carefully, unsure where this was leading. "Your vulnerability assessment regarding encryption rotation protocols has been reviewed by our technical division," Rousseau continued. "It's been validated as not only accurate but critically important. We're implementing your recommendations fleet-wide, with proper attribution to your work." "I appreciate that, ma'am. Additionally, your surveillance detection during the joint exercise prevented what could have been a significant intelligence breach. The commercial vessel you identified was confirmed to be gathering operational data for a hostile intelligence service. Your diligence potentially saved lives." Rousseau pulled up a document on her desk monitor. "Which brings me to why you're here. The Coalition is establishing a new intelligence analysis and integration division, specifically focused on empowering junior officers to flag potential threats without fear of retaliation. We need someone to help design and lead this program, someone who understands both the technical aspects and the cultural challenges." Irene's breath caught. "Ma'am, I'm a lieutenant junior grade. Surely there are more senior officers qualified." "More senior, yes. More qualified. Debatable." Rousseau's expression softened slightly. "Lieutenant Hill, you've demonstrated precisely the kind of analytical thinking and moral courage we need. The question is whether you're willing to continue serving in a navy that failed you so profoundly." The question hung in the air between them. Irene thought about everything she'd endured: the dismissals, the retaliation, the assault. She thought about how close she'd come to accepting that being small and female meant accepting limitations others placed on her. But she also thought about the changes already beginning to ripple through the fleet. Officers questioning whether suppressing competence was really leadership. Junior personnel feeling empowered to report problems. A system starting to value truth over hierarchy. "I'm willing, ma'am. But only if we're committed to genuine change, not just performative reform." Rousseau smiled for the first time. "I wouldn't have it any other way. You'll be promoted to full lieutenant immediately, with a posting here at headquarters. You'll have a team of analysts and direct access to senior leadership. Your mandate is to create systems where what happened to you can never happen again." The magnitude of the opportunity was overwhelming. 2 months ago, she'd been filing equipment manifests. Now she was being offered the chance to reshape how an entire naval coalition approached intelligence and personnel development. "I accept, ma'am." "Good. You start next month." Russo handed her a folder containing preliminary program documents. "Read through these and prepare your initial recommendations." "And Lieutenant? Don't hold back. We need your unfiltered assessment, not a politically sanitized version." As Irene left headquarters, she paused in the courtyard, looking up at the building that now represented her future. Sarah's words echoed in her mind, about seeing something in Irene that she'd lost, the willingness to be right even when uncomfortable. That night, Irene called her mother in Romania for the first time since the court-martial. Her mother had followed the case through news reports, had worried and prayed and sent dozens of messages that Irene had been too overwhelmed to answer properly. "Mama, I'm sorry I haven't called more," Irene began in Romanian. "Draga, you don't apologize. You've been fighting battles I cannot imagine." Her mother's voice carried pride mixed with concern. "Are you safe now? Is it finished?" "The trial is finished. But the work is just beginning." She explained the new position, the opportunity to create systemic change. Her mother listened quietly, then said something that made Irene's throat tighten with emotion. "When you were small, you would never let anyone tell you what you could not do. Your father, God rest him, he used to say you had the heart of a warrior but the mind of a scholar. I think you would be very proud of who you became." 3 months later, Irene stood before a conference room filled with senior officers from all coalition navies, presenting the framework for what she'd named the Junior Officer Intelligence Initiative. Her promotion to full lieutenant had been accompanied by a small team, 2 analysts, a technical specialist, and a former military psychologist who understood institutional trauma. "The fundamental problem isn't that junior officers lack competence," Irene explained, advancing her presentation slides. "It's that we've created systems where competence from junior ranks is perceived as threatening rather than valuable. When a lieutenant identifies a vulnerability, the institutional response shouldn't be 'stay in your lane,' it should be 'tell us more.'" The assembled admirals and captains listened with varying degrees of receptiveness. Some genuinely engaged with her proposals. Others radiated skepticism that a 26-year-old lieutenant was lecturing flag officers on command philosophy. Admiral Russo, serving as program sponsor, interjected when she noticed the skeptical expressions. "Before anyone dismisses Lieutenant Hill's recommendations as theoretical, I want to remind this room that her theoretical analysis identified actual security breaches that senior officers missed. Her theoretical proposals are grounded in documented failures that cost us operational intelligence. I suggest we listen carefully." Irene continued, outlining a multi-layered approach: anonymous reporting systems for intelligence concerns, mandatory technical reviews regardless of analyst rank, cultural training for senior officers on recognizing and addressing unconscious bias against junior personnel, and protection protocols for officers reporting command climate issues. "The goal isn't to undermine command authority," Irene clarified. "It's to ensure that authority is exercised in service of the mission rather than in protection of ego. Good leaders welcome competent analysis from any source. Weak leaders require constant deference to mask their insecurity." Captain Henrik Sorensen from the Danish Navy raised his hand. "Lieutenant Hill, isn't there a risk that this program encourages insubordination? That junior officers might hide behind intelligence concerns to challenge legitimate command decisions?" "There's always that risk, sir," Irene acknowledged. "Which is why the program includes accountability measures. False or frivolous reports carry consequences. But we can't let fear of potential abuse prevent us from addressing current actual abuse. Right now, we're losing valuable intelligence because competent officers are afraid to speak up. That's a greater threat than the possibility of someone gaming the system." The presentation concluded with case studies, situations where junior officer insights had been suppressed, resulting in operational failures. Some were from Irene's own experience. Others came from the dozens of officers who'd contacted her after the Strand verdict, sharing their own stories of dismissed competence and professional retaliation. After the presentation, several officers approached Irene with questions and concerns. But Captain Bergman, the prosecutor from Strand's court-martial, pulled her aside with a different message. "Lieutenant, I've been asked to inform you that 2 more senior officers have requested early retirement following internal reviews triggered by your program. Both had patterns similar to Strand, suppressing junior officer input, creating fear-based command climates." Irene absorbed this information with mixed feelings. "I never wanted to end careers, ma'am." "You didn't end them. You exposed failures that should have been addressed years ago. The officers who are leaving, they're the ones who couldn't adapt to accountability. Good riddance." Bergman's expression softened. "What you're doing matters, Hill. Keep pushing." The program rolled out over the following months. Initial results were promising. A 23-year-old ensign identified a critical flaw in navigation software that could have caused collisions in crowded shipping lanes. A junior communications specialist flagged suspicious encrypted transmissions that led to the disruption of a smuggling operation. A lieutenant in the Italian Navy developed an improved algorithm for threat assessment that was adopted fleet-wide. Each success validated Irene's fundamental argument: competence existed at every rank, and suppressing it for the sake of hierarchy served no one except insecure commanders. But success also brought new challenges. Some senior officers viewed the program as a threat to their authority. Anonymous complaints began circulating about Irene herself, claims that she was using her position to settle scores, that she was too inexperienced for such responsibility, that her agenda was more about personal vindication than operational improvement. Admiral Russo called her in to discuss the backlash. "You're making enemies, Lieutenant. Powerful ones who view reform as a personal attack." "I know, ma'am. But if we stop because of resistance, we validate their belief that accountability is negotiable. I'm not suggesting we stop. I'm suggesting we be strategic." Russo pulled up internal communications. "These complaints suggest you're being too aggressive, too uncompromising. Perhaps it's time to moderate your approach." Irene felt a familiar frustration building. This was how institutional change died, not through direct opposition, but through endless calls for moderation, for patience, for understanding the perspectives of those who benefited from broken systems. "Ma'am, with respect, I was told my analysis was too aggressive when I identified encryption vulnerabilities. I was told I was too uncompromising when I reported surveillance during the exercise. Every time someone tells me to moderate, what they're really saying is be less right in ways that make us uncomfortable." Russo studied her for a long moment. "You're correct. And that's exactly why I'm not ordering you to change course. I'm warning you about the costs of staying on it. Some of these senior officers will try to undermine you, to discredit your work, to wait until you make a mistake and then use it to dismantle everything you've built. Then I won't make mistakes, ma'am. Everyone makes mistakes, Lieutenant. The question is whether you're prepared for yours to be weaponized in ways that mistakes from senior officers never are." It was a sobering reminder that proving yourself once wasn't enough. Irene would have to be exceptional, consistently, while others waited for any opportunity to declare the experiment a failure. 6 months into the Junior Officer Intelligence Initiative, Irene received an encrypted message from an unfamiliar sender. The subject line read simply, "Thank you." The message came from Lieutenant Emma Kovacs, a Hungarian naval officer stationed with the coalition's Baltic operations. "Lieutenant Hill, I need you to know that your program saved my career and possibly lives. 3 weeks ago, I identified what I believed was a significant cybersecurity vulnerability in our fleet coordination software. Under the old system, I would have kept quiet, knowing that challenging established systems would mark me as a troublemaker. But because of your initiative, I submitted my analysis through the protected channels you created. The vulnerability was confirmed and patched before hostile actors could exploit it. My commanding officer thanked me instead of punishing me. That's the world you've helped create." Irene read the message 3 times, feeling something shift in her chest. This was why she'd endured everything: the dismissals, the assault, the ongoing attacks on her credibility. Because somewhere in the fleet, officers like Emma could now do their jobs excellently without fear. She shared the message with her team during their weekly coordination meeting. Her technical specialist, a former enlisted analyst named David Turner, smiled broadly. "We've received 47 similar messages in the past month. Junior officers across the coalition are reporting that command climates are changing, that their input is being valued. But we're also seeing resistance crystallize," added Dr. Sarah Mendez, the military psychologist on Irene's team. "Senior officers who view this as a generational attack on traditional authority. They're organizing, trying to paint the program as undermining discipline." Irene had anticipated this. Cultural change always faced organized opposition from those invested in the existing system. What form is the resistance taking? Formal complaints to the Inspector General's office, op-eds in military journals arguing that we're creating a culture of insubordination, quiet lobbying with flag officers to defund the program. Dr. Mendez pulled up several documents. "They're not attacking you directly anymore, they've learned that doesn't work. Instead, they're attacking the premise that junior officers need special protection or empowerment. Which is precisely the argument that enabled officers like Strand to abuse their authority for years," Irene observed. "The idea that hierarchy itself is sufficient protection, that good officers will naturally rise regardless of obstacles." Admiral Rousseau had warned her this would happen. Systemic change threatened not just individual careers but entire philosophies of leadership. Officers who'd built their identities around commanding through authority rather than competence couldn't accept a world where rank didn't automatically confer correctness. The confrontation came during a coalition leadership conference in Copenhagen. Irene was presenting program metrics when Rear Admiral Klaus Hoffmann, a German officer known for traditional command philosophy, interrupted with barely concealed hostility. "Lieutenant Hill, your program assumes that junior officers possess insights that senior leadership lacks. Isn't this fundamentally disrespectful to the experience and judgment that come with rank?" Irene met his gaze steadily. "Sir, my program assumes that good ideas can come from anyone, regardless of rank. It doesn't diminish senior experience, it supplements it with diverse perspectives. The best commanders have always recognized this. The best commanders maintain discipline and clear chains of authority," Hoffman countered. "What you're creating is a system where every lieutenant with a theory can bypass their immediate superiors and second-guess strategic decisions." "No, sir. What I'm creating is a system where accurate intelligence isn't suppressed because it's politically inconvenient. There's a significant difference between second-guessing strategy and identifying genuine threats." The conference room had gone silent, everyone watching this clash between a junior lieutenant and a flag officer. But this time, Irene wasn't alone and vulnerable. She had data, she had documented successes, and she had the support of officers who'd seen the program work. Vice Admiral Rousseau stood, her voice cutting through the tension. "Admiral Hoffman, Lieutenant Hill's program has directly contributed to the identification of 17 security vulnerabilities, 12 operational improvements, and 3 intelligence breaches in 6 months. Perhaps rather than debating philosophy, we should be asking why traditional systems failed to catch these issues." Hoffman's face reddened, but he said nothing more. The message was clear: the program had proven its value in ways that transcended theoretical arguments about authority and discipline. After the conference, several junior officers approached Irene privately, sharing their own stories of how the program had changed their experiences. A French ensign who'd identified a maintenance issue that prevented a potential disaster. An Italian lieutenant whose analysis improved rescue operation protocols. A Polish communications specialist whose threat assessment had been taken seriously instead of dismissed. Each story reinforced what Irene had always believed: competence existed everywhere, and the only question was whether leadership had the wisdom to recognize and utilize it. That evening, sitting alone in her hotel room overlooking Copenhagen's harbor, Irene drafted a message to Emma Kovacs and the dozens of other officers who'd reached out to thank her. "You don't owe me thanks. You owe yourselves recognition that you are always capable of excellence. The system that suppressed you was broken, not you. All I did was refuse to accept that broken systems were inevitable. Keep being excellent. Keep speaking up. Keep proving that competence matters more than rank." That's how we make these changes permanent. 1 year after Admiral Strand's court-martial, Irene stood on the deck of a new frigate being commissioned into the coalition fleet, the HMS Integrity. The name had been chosen deliberately, a signal that the Navy was embracing new values. She'd been invited to the commissioning ceremony as a guest of honor, though her rank still didn't warrant such recognition under traditional protocols. But these weren't traditional times. Vice Admiral Rousseau delivered the keynote address, and her words carried weight beyond the ceremony. This vessel represents more than advanced technology and naval capability. It represents our commitment to a culture where truth matters more than hierarchy, where competence is celebrated regardless of its source, where officers at every rank are empowered to serve with excellence and integrity. Rousseau's eyes found Irene in the crowd. A year ago, a junior lieutenant refused to accept that assault and suppression were acceptable costs of military service. Her courage exposed systemic failures and forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about how power had been wielded and abused. Today, we commission this vessel in recognition that integrity, personal and institutional, must be the foundation of everything we do. The assembled officers and dignitaries applauded. Irene felt Andreas squeeze her shoulder supportively. He'd been promoted to lieutenant commander and was now serving as a department head on another vessel, implementing the cultural changes they'd fought for. After the ceremony, a young ensign approached Irene nervously. She couldn't have been more than 22, her uniform crisp and new, her eyes carrying that mixture of hope and uncertainty that Irene remembered from her own early service. "Lieutenant Hill? I'm Ensign Marie Dubois. I just wanted to say that I joined the Navy because of what you did. My recruitment officer told me about an organization that was learning to value competence over compliance, and I wanted to be part of that." Irene smiled, genuinely touched. "Then do me a favor, Ensign. Be excellent at your job. Speak up when you identify problems. Don't let anyone convince you that being small, or young, or female, or anything else means your competence matters less. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am. I promise." As the ensign walked away, Sarah Brennan joined Irene at the railing, looking out over the harbor. "You know what the best part of all this is? 3 months ago, I was offered a command position. They're putting me in charge of a destroyer. 2 years ago, that would have been unthinkable for a woman in this Navy." "You earned it through competence," Irene replied. "Maybe. But you created the environment where my competence could be recognized. That matters, Irene." Admiral Rousseau found them as the ceremony was concluding. "Lieutenant Hill, I have news. The Coalition Leadership Council has voted to expand your program to all member navies permanently. Additionally, they've created a new position, Director of Intelligence Integration and Officer Development. It comes with a promotion to Lieutenant Commander and significant resources. The job is yours if you want it." Lieutenant Commander. Just over a year ago, she'd been a junior lieutenant filing equipment manifests and being told she lacked command presence. Now she was being offered a position that would shape how the entire coalition approached personnel development and intelligence analysis. "I want it, ma'am. And I promise to use it to ensure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else." "I know you will. That's why we're trusting you with it." That evening, Irene sat in her Brussels apartment, looking at a framed photograph on her desk. It showed her father in his Romanian Navy uniform, taken decades ago before illness had claimed him. He'd always told her that being small didn't mean being insignificant, that true strength came from refusing to accept unjust limitations. She thought about everything that had happened since that morning in Strand's ready room, the assault, the investigation, the court-martial, the program that had emerged from her refusal to be silenced. None of it had been easy. All of it had been necessary. Her phone buzzed with a message from Lieutenant Emma Kovacs. "Just heard about your promotion. Well deserved. You changed everything for all of us. Thank you." Irene typed a response. "We changed it together. Keep being excellent. That's how we make it permanent." She stood and walked to her window, looking out over Brussels as evening settled over the city. Somewhere in the coalition fleet, junior officers were doing excellent work without fear of retaliation. Somewhere, commanders were learning to lead through empowerment rather than intimidation. Somewhere, the culture was shifting toward valuing truth over hierarchy. It wasn't perfect yet. There were still officers who resisted change, still pockets of the old culture that clung to authority through fear. But the direction was clear, the momentum building. Admiral Strand had struck her for speaking truth. In doing so, he'd ended his career and started a revolution in how the Navy understood leadership, accountability, and the value of competence from any source. Irene smiled, thinking about that moment when she'd pulled out her phone to document the assault. That decision, to refuse silence, to demand accountability, to insist that being right mattered more than being comfortable, had changed everything. She returned to her desk and opened her laptop. Tomorrow, she would begin work as Director of Intelligence Integration and Officer Development. There would be new challenges, new resistance, new battles to fight for cultural change. But tonight, she allowed herself to feel pride in how far they'd come. From overlooked specialist to change agent. From victim of assault to architect of reform. From silenced to amplified. The journey had cost her comfort, safety, and the easy path of compliance. But it had gained something infinitely more valuable, a Navy that was learning to be better, to value truth, to recognize that excellence could come from anyone who had the courage to pursue it. Irene pulled up her calendar and began planning next week's meetings. There was so much work ahead, so many systems still to reform, so many officers still to empower. She was ready. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.